Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. If ever a problem seemed intractable, it's homelessness. After many decades of trying to find solutions, there are still tens of thousands of homeless men, women, and children here in New York City. But there are also many dedicated people who work day and night to bring shelter and badly needed services to many thousands of people who otherwise would have nowhere to turn. One of those dedicated individuals is my guest, Stephen Banks, who has been leading simultaneously the city's vast Human Resources Administration and the Department of Homeless Services. I knew Steve Banks long before he joined city government. He has been a preeminent leader in the fight against homelessness in this town since the 1980s, and it's a pleasure to welcome him now. Steve, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thank you for having me. And we're as young as we used to be.
Exactly. I may be a little younger. I don't know. I'm trying. You've announced that you'll be leaving your post at HRA and the Department of Homeless Services when the de Blasio administration ends. So during the course of this program, we're going to take a look at where we are now with regard to homelessness, what you feel you've accomplished, and what's still to be done if we're ever going to get close to solving this issue. But let's start with COVID. As if the homeless problem were not difficult in and of itself, the coronavirus pandemic showed up on your watch. So tell us about the special challenges that COVID-19 presented and how you dealt or tried to deal with those challenges.
Well, as you know, Bob, I run two agencies which together serve about 3 million people in New York City.
Is that all?
Right. I mean, the Human Resource Administration serves 3 million people a year, and the Department of Homeless Services right now is serving less than 50,000. But when COVID hit, we had to dramatically change the way we were providing services to people. First of all, there was a historic increase in need for food stamps, SNAP, and cash assistance. And we had to make sure those benefits were available to people without having to come into our offices. And so we built upon reforms that we had put in place over the prior years to make it possible to get benefits online and by telephone. And we got special waivers from the federal and state government to allow our staff to take applications over the phone. We kept a certain skeleton offices open for those people that wanted to come in, notwithstanding the health guidance to not come in. And at the same time, we created a whole system for our staff to be able to serve clients from their homes remotely. In terms of people experiencing homelessness, for our families with children and family systems, those are self-contained living units and people could shelter in place, as it were. But for our single adults, we literally evacuated a small village, 10,000 people at the height of the pandemic, and took them out of congregate shelters and put them into commercial hotels, predominantly in Midtown, to save lives and to prevent the spread of the virus in our shelter system. And the real heroes on our staff and the not-for-profit staff who did that at a time when the entire city was shut down for safety reasons.
Mayor de Blasio selected you to be his commissioner of human resources, but that's not primarily focused on homelessness. Nevertheless, you ended up with responsibility for homelessness anyway. How did that happen?
Well, you know, for many years, I was at the Legal Aid Society, 33 years altogether. In the last 10 that I was there, I ran the organization. I wanted to come into government because I thought there was an opportunity to make change. And as I said, the Human Resources Administration touches 3 million people and is at the forefront of fighting poverty. One of the realities, though, is that when the Department of Homeless Services was split out of the Human Resources Administration in the 90s, uh, all of the prevention tools that HRA has were unavailable to address homelessness because HRA and DHS essentially went their separate ways. In my first years as the HRA commissioner, I wanted to focus on ways in which we could prevent homelessness. Even though we were not the Department of Homeless Services, we knew that we had tools that could be offered and should be offered. And we began to develop what became the right to counsel in housing court to prevent people from losing their homes. There was nothing more frustrating when I was a legal aid lawyer than me talking to somebody in a shelter and looking at their legal papers and knowing that if they had a lawyer, they could have kept a roof over their heads. And we began to pay more rent arrears payments, and we developed rental assistance programs, all of which were key tools which had not been available to address homelessness. You probably want me to explain how did I end up becoming the commissioner of two agencies, though?
Yes, as a matter of fact. You know, I mean, I understand it because I know who you are and I know a lot about your background, but that is a combination. Well, one, I doubt that that's happened before, even with other agencies, but it seems to have worked out well. And the reason it seems to have worked out well is that there are a number of people who have said that you've had some real successes in the fight against homelessness since you took over responsibility in that area. You and the mayor have also said there have been some disappointments as well. So we want to talk about both of them. But let's look first at the upside. What do you think are the areas where you made real progress in this fight during your tenure?
So I think the most important thing that we did was, a couple of years into the mayor's first term, he asked me to conduct a review of homeless services as the HRA commissioner. And among the recommendations that we came up with was that you should reunite the Department of Homeless Services with the Human Resources Administration so that the prevention tools that HRA had could be brought to bear. One of the first things I did when I became the HRA commissioner is we did an analysis that showed that there was an association between HRA public assistance case closings and people applying for shelter. And so it stands to reason if you're the commissioner of both, maybe before cutting someone off of benefits, you're going to think about what's going to happen to them. So having that unitary structure, I thought was important to make real reforms in the way that homeless services were provided. But for the first time in 40 years, and as you know, the city for 40 years managed to court orders that we had gotten with respect to providing shelter, but it didn't have a real comprehensive plan. So we developed a comprehensive plan that has 4 pillars to it. Let me go through them and you'll see the upsides and the work still to be done in each of them. First and foremost, common sense. If you were developing a plan, the first thing you would say would be we got to prevent homelessness wherever we can. So the first pillar of the 4 pillars, prevent homelessness wherever you can. The right to counsel, I think, is one of the things that has worked well. Pre-pandemic, we had reduced evictions by 41% in New York City, whereas all across the country, evictions were up. So providing lawyers to people, like we always said, actually works. And HRA doubled the amount of money that it provides for rent arrears. We went from $125 million to $250 million because the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is really true. Second important pillar, and this is just basic, homelessness is about being without housing. It's the state of not having housing. And so the Department of Social Services, HRA and DHS, developed our own social services housing programs. Together, those programs have helped 175,000 people obtain and retain housing. And you can see the results overall. And the result is that the census, the shelter system census, which as you and I know is the bellwether back to the time of Koch, the Department of Homeless Services census, it's not a full court vision of homelessness in the city, but it's a marker that's been in place for decades. The shelter system at the time of the beginning of the de Blasio administration had 53,000 people in it. It went up to 61,000. Projections showed it would have gone up to 71,000 if we hadn't made the investments we did. Today, it's about 46,000.
Wow.
So the upside is the first significant reduction in homelessness in the DHS shelter system in decades. In fact, between 1994 and 2014, homelessness increased in New York City in the DHS shelter census by 115%.
I wrote about that. I mean, it was out of control.
Absolutely, and particularly the last 3 years of the Bloomberg administration, it increased nearly 40% when the city and state cut off rental assistance in the Advantage program. So I think a success is the beginning of a systemic, sustained reduction in the numbers of people in DHS shelter. But you know, Bob, if there's one person in shelter, that is one person too many. So we have a ways to go to reduce that census to where it should be, but it's come down significantly as a result of these investments. The third pillar is transforming the approach to shelter. If you or I became homeless, we would want to be sheltered as close as possible to the anchors of our lives: schools, jobs, healthcare, houses of worship, instead of what the system was that built up in a haphazard way over 40 years, which was wherever they could site shelters in the middle of the night that opened them. We said, no, we're going to site shelters where people are coming from. And literally every community board in this city has people who are experiencing homelessness. We need to give people the opportunity to be sheltered as close as possible to the anchors of their lives. But we're not just going to build a huge shelter system. We're going to close places that don't meet standards and which are harmful to people. So we said we'd get out of the 21-year-old Giuliani cluster program. Done. We've eliminated that program. We said we would, by 2023, get out of commercial hotels. By the end of this calendar year, by the end of this month, there'll be no families with children in commercial hotels. So we've closed more than 290 locations, and we've cited a smaller number of 99 borough-based shelters, 51 already up and running. So I think that the message here is you need prevention, you need housing, and you need a decent shelter when people need it, but it needs to be connected to your communities. So work in progress, certainly metrics going in the right direction, but still more work to be done. And I think one of the big challenges as I see it, you know, when you and I first knew each other, we were at the height of deinstitutionalization in terms of people being released from psychiatric facilities in the state and ending up on the streets of the city and then ending up in the shelter system. I see history repeating itself now with decarceration, people being released from prison and going right to shelter. Right. So whereas the families with children shelter census is down by 17,000 people, the single adult census is at record highs. So I think there's got to be more housing available for single adults when they come out of correctional facilities to avoid the prison to shelter pipeline. Last but not least is obviously street homelessness. And there, if you and I walk in the streets of the city, we're going to encounter somebody experiencing street homelessness. But I'll tell you that the recipe to begin to reduce that number is there. And that is more outreach workers. We tripled the number of outreach workers from 200 to more than 600. And low barrier beds, safe haven beds, low demand beds. We went from 600 to more than 3,000. We're going to, we've set a pipeline for 1,500 open next year in the first year of the ads administration. But nonetheless, and we brought 4,200 people off the streets who've remained off the streets. That's the gold standard. Give people the opportunity to come off, remain off the streets. But still, and this is my great frustration, I leave with this thought as I leave government. You know, we've made tremendous reforms. We eliminated the WEP program. We cut fair hearings in half. As you can see, we've made tremendous reforms in the shelter system. Thousands, tens of thousands of people have benefited from our reforms. But on any given day, you could walk into one of our offices, one of our shelters, and there's still people who haven't yet felt the benefit of those reforms. And that's what keeps me up at night, making sure that the reforms become deep enough so that everybody experiences them. And that's really, I think, now will fall to the next administration. I'm going back to practice law. I think that I've learned before I was in government that a court order can hold government accountable. When I'm in government, I've certainly made sure that I comply with the court orders. But I think there's a role to be said for enforcing the rights of people who frequently have their rights violated.
So I remember the days when you were driving administrations crazy. You were not in government, of course. You were filing those lawsuits. I especially remember Ed Koch. Sometimes it looked like the top of his head was going to fly off because of Stephen Banks, you know. So, you know, I wonder if that's going to start happening again. You're going back to practice law and start filing these lawsuits. So I would say for the next mayor and whoever follows, you know, look out. But, talking about those days when you were with Legal Aid, and I remember when I was back at the Daily News, this was back in the 1980s, you were the one who filed the landmark lawsuit that required this. Ended up, you won that lawsuit that forced the city to provide shelter to homeless families. In other words, the city had an obligation and has now an obligation by law to provide shelter for homeless families. How did that suit come about, and how were you able to win it?
Well, it came about because in the way that all legal aid lawsuits come about. I mean, legal aid is an organization that represents flesh and blood clients. It's not an organization simply about, vindicating paper rights. It's about people who come in the door who need help. Yvonne McCain came to the Legal Aid Society. She was a survivor of domestic violence. The city said initially, the Human Resources Administration said to her, we don't provide shelter. You have to find a place to go. We don't give you shelter. Eventually, they provided her with shelter, and she went to the Martinique Hotel in Herald Square, where I think one judge wrote that the number of vermin outnumbered the people. 2 beds for a family of 8. I'm sorry, 7. And it just was no way to treat children. Their food was hung out of the window in order to try to keep the milk from spoiling. She was made a makeshift refrigerator by holding her milk out in the cold. This was no way to treat children.
Right.
And, in the 1930s, New York State enacted a constitutional provision that said the provision of aid and care to the needy was an obligation of the state and the city. And that provision, was a wonderful requirement, but it wasn't really being enforced. And there were court cases that said it really wasn't enforceable. People tried to bring litigation challenging the amount of the public assistance grant. Ultimately, there was litigation on behalf of single adults. We brought litigation on behalf of families with children. Eventually, I was involved with both the cases. And the court determined ultimately that Article 17 meant what it said, and that there was a right to receive aid and care to the needy. It took 25 years of litigation before the Bloomberg administration ultimately agreed to settle for a permanent right to shelter for families of children. But I have to say, when we brought the litigation, we were picketed by a group called the Redistribute America Movement, the Downtown Welfare Advocate Center, saying clients want permanent housing. And clients are right. And so in developing our plan, when we put our plan in place for the city government 5 years ago, it's not just about shelter. It's about the need to prevent people from becoming homeless, and it's about the need to provide permanent housing. And I think that the plan has created a real foundation for fundamental reform in New York City. Reform doesn't happen overnight. The urgency of now for clients is real. But I think we put in place a reform approach to homeless services that really would stand the city well. A future administration could provide more housing. That would make a great deal of difference. A future administration could provide more prevention. That would make a great deal of difference. But what nobody can do is have a plan that doesn't include those 3 basics: prevention, housing, and shelter for people that might lose their housing, to make sure they don't end up on the streets.
So why is there such a dearth of affordable housing in New York City? Is it simply a case of the economy, that everything in New York is so much more expensive, that housing is unaffordable for so many ordinary people with ordinary incomes? Or are there other reasons? Why such a lack of housing?
Well, I think if you look at New York City, it's not so different from other urban areas. Look at Los Angeles. Los Angeles, there's no right to shelter. You have tens of thousands of people living in the street. New York City, there is a right to shelter. You have tens of thousands of people living in shelter, smaller number on the streets who we work every night to bring in. But I think the experience that people have in these urban areas, it's not to discount the problem of rural homelessness, but in these urban areas, there's a real gap between rent and income, and that's built up over years. I like to tell the story that at one time, the Legal Aid Society's largest neighborhood office was the office that served the west side of Manhattan from 34th Street to Battery west of Broadway. You wouldn't think of a large client base there. But as we have seen so-called progress, the lowest income New Yorkers have been left out of that progress too often. And the depth of the housing affordability crisis is the driver of homelessness in New York City and all across the country. It's the reason why I continue to have great hope at the federal level that if we made Section 8 an entitlement, that we could make a big difference. Section 8 is, of course, the program that helps subsidize rents. But unlike someone like me, where I'm lucky enough to be able to own my home, I have a right to federal housing assistance. That federal housing assistance is the form of the mortgage deduction.
Right.
But my clients who don't own their homes don't have a right to federal housing assistance. And that's got to change at the federal level. In the meantime, there's more that can be done at the state level and at the local level to continue to move forward to literally make the progress that we have brought much deeper so that we don't have the numbers of people in the shelter system. I think we've created the foundation for progress, but more needs to be done.
I've got a two-part question. Why did you become a lawyer? And once you became a lawyer, how did you come to focus so intensely on homelessness?
Well, you know, I was going to be a rabbi,
Uh-oh.
but I went to my rabbi, who I had great respect for, Roland Gittleson, and he said, you know, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I became a rabbi. You know, I decided that every one of my clients wasn't going to be like the Scopes trial and Inherit the Wind. But if you can see your life as a life of small cases add up to big cases, and a small case for somebody is a big case in their life, why don't you go be a lawyer? So I became a lawyer. I went to, you know, literally from the maternity ward to the Legal Aid Society. I was so young.
Exactly. Must have been the case.
But, you know, I've said this to you over time. I worked on so many different cases when I was at the Legal Aid Society. I know that people associate me with our litigation on behalf of people experiencing homelessness, but I worked on a broad range of cases. And as I said earlier, that kind of case really came out of the essence of what legal aid does, which is individual clients come in with real serious problems, and together lawyers work on systemic reforms at the same time as they help individual clients every day. It's an organization that handles 300,000 legal matters a year. I'm blessed now to be going to work at Paul Weiss, which is a major law firm in the city, to oversee their pro bono program.
We've heard of it. Boy.
It's a tremendous opportunity to be part of I was lucky to be part of a storied history of the Legal Aid Society and making a difference for New Yorkers in New York City. And I was fortunate enough to be the commissioner, I think, to make a difference in the lives of many people and create a foundation for even better results for many people. And now the opportunity to go and use a law degree to continue to do the great work that the law firm does and that is needed on behalf of low-income people in the city. I think I've had a lot of opportunities and I'm grateful for them. Knowing you is one opportunity because your reporting was really instrumental in our litigation in the 1980s. I can remember standing with you in what were then called welfare hotels. They were the kind of place Yvonne McCain went to. We don't have those in New York City anymore. And that's because of reporting that you and others did, but it's also because of lawsuits that we brought. And I think that's an important thing to continue to remember, the role that the press can play in shedding light on the experience of clients. But I remember in those days, you used to sometimes do stories there were two stories, right? One was government did something, hooray, they did it great. And the other was government did something, it didn't work out, uh-oh. And it's important to remember that we have the balance that as you said, in government, there are things we're doing that are working, and there are some things that are doing that are not working. We should be held to task for the things that are not working, but we should focus on the things that are working, because many people have struggled for many years to get things like the right to counsel, rental assistance, and so forth.
That's an excellent point, because in the news business, obviously we tend to focus on what's gone wrong, and if something is going right, it's humming along, you know, we don't see it as a story. but you at least need to take time, from time to time, to point out what's going right. I wish we had more time to talk, Steve. This has been great. Good luck in your new endeavor, and thank you for all the great work that you've done over many years now. Take care.
Great to see you. Thanks for all your work.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.